Come with me as once more we travel into the dark depths of English social history. Today we look at torture. Hi guys, welcome back to Social History Sunday. I nearly forgot that. Right, this week we're talking about torture. What it was, who it was used by, and why. Now, the first thing you've got to realise, again, this is another situation. The subject is huge. However, we're looking at it from an English perspective. Now, the English perspective on torture within medieval Europe was actually quite unique. Well, unique's the wrong word, but it was unlike the rest of Europe. Because, now I don't know whether this is because English society was made up of different cultures all merged into one under the Norman conquest. For instance, we had Angles and Saxons and Vikings and Celts and Gaels and Bretons, and we had a lot of people who came to medieval England to make up the English ideology. And it's a little bit different, and it dates back to the Roman period. But the subject is so it makes things a little bit different. Now, throughout Europe, torture, throughout the medieval, even into the Renaissance and the modern era, torture was quite ubiquitous. But not only was it used to obtain information, it was also used as a punishment. Now this is where England is a little bit different. Generally speaking, the English authorities didn't use torture as a punishment. Now that sounds a bit odd, but when if you can look at it this way, yes, torture could be included in the process as part of a death sentence, for instance being broken on the wheel, things like that, being hung, drawn and quartered. That must have been quite torturous, but it was part of the death sentence for particular crimes. Generally speaking though, torture was seen as being ineffective. It was seen as being unproductive and, generally speaking, frowned upon, and in some cases actually unlawful outside specific circumstances. There were even laws passed to denote what those specific circumstances were. Now, right across the board, generally speaking, torture of females, of women, was frowned upon. In some cases it was actually illegal. There were other things that could be done. And that all started, well, okay, we're getting a bit ahead of ourselves. We'll go back to the Anglo-Saxon. And prior to the Norman conquest, torture was very rarely used at all. When it was of a self-inflicted nature, as in trial by ordeal, that sort of thing, whereby an accused person would opt to undertake quite a torturous activity in order to prove their innocence. And it was only for capital crimes that people, generally speaking, were tortured to obtain confessions. But for general, ordinary, everyday events, it wasn't used. However, in stark contrast, for instance, if you just look at Germany, they were quite brutal. They would use torture at the drop of a hat. And to be honest with you, most of the time, when torture was implemented in places like Germany, Spain, France, Italy, it tended to end up being fatal. The amount of damage, like for instance the boot the boot was an implement that was used in Germany quite a lot, where both your feet would be clamped in a boot, in an iron boot, and then wedges would be forced in to the boot to crush your feet. That tended to cause such extreme damage that massive, unless you were really, really lucky, massive infection would set in. And that's if you didn't bleed to death during the torture process. And that was implemented for all sorts of reasons. Trying to obtain confessions about whether or not you'd had an adulterous affair. Really strange situations. If you look at the Spanish Inquisition, the torture that they inflicted on people was unbelievable. Those torture methods were never used in England, really. And it was just frowned upon. It was seen as being ineffective. The Anglo-Saxons would rather rely on the fact that you knew you weren't going to get tortured. You knew that probably the most you were going to get, if it was a non-capital crime, was a monetary fine. And if you'd committed a capital crime, the easiest way to get a quick death was to confess. So the Anglo-Saxons knew about that, and people reacted accordingly. The threat of torture was always there, but was very rarely used. And then we come to the Norman era. Not so much under William, but once we get to Henry II, torture becomes even more and more frowned upon for daily judicial purposes. Now, the ecclesiastical courts. See, England had several different types of court. They had legal courts, they had ecumenical or ecclesiastical, and they had civil courts. Each of those courts had different methods and different ways of doing things. Now, the ecclesiastical courts, the church courts that were run by the monks, priests of in the area, they still believed in trial by ordeal, which would be a self-inflicted type of torture. But they did it in such a way, see, this is a whole different subject which we'll talk about another way, where it wasn't really a form of torture. Yes, to the person who was undergoing it, it was very painful and it was traumatic, but it was done in such a way without the without the perpetrator's knowledge. The priests did it in such a way, the monks did it in such a way that there wasn't really a great deal of damage caused. But we'll talk about that. It's a really interesting subject. That we'll talk about that in another video. When we get to Henry II and his implementation of common law, the Angevin kings, like the late Plantagenet kings, were trying to push towards trial by jury. This is what they wanted more than anything else. This was quite an enlightened way of thinking, by the way. No other country did trial by jury. So they wanted to push the whole trial by jury thing. So from Henry II onwards, up until Edward I, Edward I, 2 years after he came to the throne, actually passed a law which stated categorically that torture was unlawful except in specific circumstances, and they were treason. Torture could be used to obtain a confession or information in relation to treason. Capital crimes such as murder, rape, that sort of thing, it could be used to obtain a confession, but only if there were insufficient witnesses available to testify against the accused. And when we get to the King's Bench, when we get to the travelling judges, the standard of proof was actually higher then than it is today. I mean, today you can be convicted on circumstantial evidence, on the testimony of a single eyewitness, even just a single shred of DNA evidence today will convict you. In the medieval, under the common law system, you needed to have 2 eyewitnesses. Not 1, 2. A minimum of 2 eyewitnesses who saw you commit the crime. Now, failing that, the courts had to have a confession. Torture could be used to extract a confession, but generally speaking, somebody accused of a capital crime, knowing that they could be tortured, if they were guilty, tended to plead guilty anyway. So torture was very rarely used, and it seemed to be an acknowledged thing that, generally speaking, if somebody was refusing to confess and they were faced with torture, that generally speaking, if they continued to proclaim their innocence, that generally they were. That ties back in with what I was talking about, the trial by ordeal with the church as well. But there was also, the type of tortures were also limited as well. Within England, for capital crimes and treachery, the main source of torture was the rack. They did use the wheel, but that generally tended to be as part of your death sentence. So generally it tended to be the threat of a beating was one form of, you could be beaten up in order to try and extract a confession. But generally speaking, if you were facing torture to extract a confession in a capital crime or an accusation of treachery, you'd be put on the rack. Now the rack, generally speaking, by most academics who have studied the subject, it tends to be considered the most effective means of extraction of a confession quite quickly. There are examples of people being on the rack for half an hour and being virtually crippled, and they will confess within half an hour. But there are also cases of people being on the rack for hours and hours and hours and not confessing at all. But generally speaking, people confessed within 20 minutes to half an hour of being on the rack. And it depended how good the torturer was as well. A lot of damage can be inflicted by the rack quite quickly, and the damage done is excruciatingly painful, as in snapped ligaments, dislocated joints, and in extreme cases, like limbs, mainly arms, actually torn from the body. But generally speaking, a good torturer wouldn't let it get that far. You would have confessed a long time before then. So that's basically it. Within England, torture wasn't a massive thing. The funny thing is, once we get into the really late medieval, in the time of the Henry VIII, the Tudors and the Stuarts, torture comes back in, big style. Now I don't know whether this was under the influence of things that were happening in Europe, but it became more and more commonplace for people to be tortured. Now there were other things that went on within the judicial systems that people could equate as being torture. For instance, the ducking stool. A lot of people consider the ducking stool to be a torture, but it wasn't. It was actually generally used as a female version of the pillory. Now the pillory wasn't a torture, it was an embarrassment. But people were put into the pillory and were pelted with anything. Rotten vegetables, horse manure, human feces, whatever anybody could get hold of that could be thrown at. Now that was considered to be not unlawful but inappropriate for women to be inflicted. So what they would do, what would happen to them is they would actually be put on a ducking stool and they'd be lowered into a river or a pond or whatever, and then they'd be underwater for a few minutes, well, a minute or so, brought up, they'd cough and splutter and bedraggled, and then people would throw things at them. They'd be ducked again, and it was just the act of them being ducked and then being ridiculed and ducked and ridiculed. It was the female version of the pillory. Now the other thing that happened quite a lot, which was torturous, was being broken on the wheel. Now that was quite barbaric, and Generally speaking, it was done as an execution rather than just a torture, because people tended not to survive it. Once it was done, that was it. You were over and done with, whether you'd actually confessed or not, except under certain circumstances. And basically what it was, they'd get an old cartwheel and they would break your arms and legs in two places. They'd break your forearm and your upper arm on both sides, and they'd break your lower leg and your upper leg. Now, if you imagine breaking your upper leg, your femur, takes an inordinate amount of force to break your upper leg, and it was done with iron bars. So there you straight away you've got an incredible amount of force being inflicted on the human body. And then you were laced onto a wheel with your arms through the spokes and your legs through the spokes. And then the wheel was hoisted up onto a pole and you were left there. Now, it wasn't an incredibly common thing to happen in England, but it did happen. The good thing about it was, though, it was also considered to be a sort of trial by ordeal, which doesn't bear thinking about, really. So you'd have your limbs broken, and then you'd be threaded onto this wheel, and then you would be left for however long it took for you to die. However, if you somehow managed to work yourself loose, or if you lapsed into unconsciousness and fell off the wheel and survived the fall, you were considered to have been found not guilty by God, and you would actually be treated and cared for. Chances are you would die, but you would be considered an innocent person, because they thought the only way anybody could get off the wheel, because of the way the limbs were threaded through the spokes after being broken, was if the intervention of God. So that was another thing as well. The other thing which was done to traitors was being hung, drawn and quartered. Now, elements of that would be considered to be torturous, but it wasn't considered torture. That was part of your death sentence. You'd have your genitals cut off and burnt in front of you, and then you'd be split from anus to the base of your rib cage, and all your entrails would be took out, by which point you would probably be dead. Maybe not. At some point during the proceedings, you would actually be hung until you were practically dead as well, and then you would either be just cut in four with a big axe, or you would be torn into pieces by big horses. The problem with the big horse thing is once you would have to be tied down. So that was maybe, and if you were still alive at that point, I don't think you'd be feeling anything, you'd be unconscious, but that you would literally just be torn limb from limb. But again, not as part of the torture, but part of your execution for treason. Now, other things that were done as well was, again, which some people considered to be a torture method, was being burnt at the stake. It wasn't. It was an execution. That was usually what you would end up being done to you after you'd been on the rack. If you survived the rack as a form of confession for a capital crime, and if your capital crime was treason, chances are you'd be getting burnt at the stake after being broken on the rack. However, if you think about what was going, all sounds incredibly barbaric. However, if you consider what was going on on the continent, people having arms literally broken again and again and again, the boot, thumb screws, toe choppers, which were basically just a thumb screw for all 10 toes at the same time, which would be cranked down until your toes came off. The boot, the hand, which was a similar sort of thing, but you'd actually put your hand in a metal cage and a screw would be tightened until it actually crushed the bones in your hand. Having your tongue nipped with red hot irons to make your tongue flat, but at the same time, there was all sorts of horrible, disgusting things going on. Now in England, yeah, for capital crimes, torture was a bit of a no-no, especially for women. But corporal punishment was a completely different thing. Again, that's another video. Anyway, there's not a great deal more you can say about talking about specific cases, which I don't really want to get into. But it's just another example of what was actually quite, well, I'll use the word unique, a little bit unique about English medieval society. The fact that we didn't employ torture techniques that were, I mean, some of the ones they used on the continent, like breast rippers. Unmarried mothers would have their breasts put in basically like a claw arrangement, which would be tightened down, and then it would just be ripped, and that would shred the breasts. There was a device called the pear, which would be put into a woman's nether regions and expanded and then just ripped out. The damage that was done, this was all for having an affair, or for being an unmarried mother. I mean, they did use things like scold's bridles in England, but they weren't the same scold's bridle as was used on the continent. Like a scold's bridle in France would actually shred your tongue. It would be tightened down. It would actually shred your tongue as it did it. Whereas a scold's bridle in England, you were literally just gagged, and you were made to wear this for whatever length of time. So it wasn't really torture, it was just a punishment. Anyway, there's lots more to it, and there are a few subjects within this subject I'm going to do other videos about. But anyway, that's enough for now. I hope you found it interesting. Stay safe, keep slinging the sticks, and we'll talk again soon. Cheers, guys.